Hello and welcome. You're tuning into the Hindustan Times Leadership Studio, and I have the privilege to be joined by Deepesh Nanda. He's the CEO of GE Gas Power South Asia. Deepesh, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to speak to us at the HTLS. Now, the COP27 playing out in Egypt, we are seeing global leaders converge and discuss about what national priorities should be in a time like this, where more than ever before, there is so much conversation around, how nations, governments, organizations should take responsibility about the climate and therefore also make serious commitments towards that. Let's talk about India's own energy transition story. We have made some serious commitments in the last edition of the COP, as well. But what do you think, we're doing right at this point in time? And what do you think, still needs to be done to ensure that we stay on with the commitments we've made?
Thanks for having me here. I think this COP27, the challenge in front of nations is to make sure that the Earth's temperature doesn't exceed the 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050 as compared to the pre-industrial world. And I believe that's quite a formidable challenge. And the reason is that today in 2022, the increase in temperature has already reached 1.2 degrees. So there's very little left for us to contain between the 1.2 and 1.5. And the challenge is in terms of the emissions that we currently emanate. The world approximately emanates 35 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. And for us to contain the increase in temperature by 1.5 degrees by the 2050 timeline, we only have 500 gigatons and no more to emanate. So you can do the math. We have 28 years to go. Our annual release is 35 gigatons. That has to be close to 16, 17. So forget about the future. Currently, today, here and now, we need to reduce emissions by 50%.
Sure.
That's the challenge in front of us. Now, when it comes to India, I think India has demonstrated leadership in terms of clean energy. Since 2014, we have added close to 125 gigawatts of green electricity, which is wind and solar. That journey continues and must continue. And then with the advent of newer fuels like hydrogen, I think this will only accelerate the availability of green hydrogen, reduce carbon emissions, and we'll play a role in keeping the world green and safe.
Lovely. So to the more specific point of, what India can do, and of course this involves the government, it also involves large corporations which have to play their part. But do you think that we're more or less on the track that we did, commit ourselves to?
I think, phase one of the journey was done very successfully, and I would define phase one as coming up with large-scale wind turbine plants and solar plants. But I think the era of a pure vanilla wind turbine and solar turbine plant is probably over, because what the industry and what the country needs is around-the-clock electricity with a green electron. Now, the intermittency that's there in wind and solar, that kind of doesn't allow in the current context for us to produce round-the-clock green electricity.
Sure.
And that's where I believe that the aspect of new age fuels like hydrogen fits in. In addition to that, you'll have to do some tweaks with the grid. So a combination of accelerated growth in wind and solar, making sure that the grid is capable of absorbing the wind and solar. The intermittency question can be addressed either through batteries or a combination of hydro. And then I've mentioned hydrogen, thrice already. So I think a combination of this will be the phase two. And that phase two journey is what is likely to accelerate our growth in the era of clean energy.
Right. And that emphasis on hydrogen clearly is evident in the way the government seems to be approaching it as well. There is a green hydrogen policy in place. But on ground, there's very little in terms of availability, whether it's infrastructure or even technologies that we've been able to build out. And some of the discussion around hydrogen fuel cells is already starting to gather pace. But of course, we go back to the questions of infra and availability. So what do you think, where do we find ourselves currently then with respect to both of those things? And how soon do you think that this will start to become a sort of a realistic proposition for us?
Great question. So when it comes to hydrogen, the good part of it is that India has the know-how on how to handle the hydrogen atom. The fact that we already produce 6 to 7 million tons of hydrogen every year, albeit grey, but most of it used for fertilizers, petrochemical, kind of tells us that there is an ecosystem on how to handle hydrogen. You talked about the policy. The policy was the first step in terms of defining what will be our roadmap towards coming up with 5 million tons per annum of hydrogen by 2030. The policy framework is at its nascent stage. I think we should take some inspiration from what's been enacted, say, in the United States, which is the IRA, where you have incentives provided, financial incentives for the OEMs to come up with things like electrolyzers to produce hydrogen in a time-bound manner. And all this is to reduce the cost of hydrogen. There are large Indian companies who have already made commitments in terms of coming up with either joint venture partnerships to manufacture electrolyzers. And then the use case of hydrogen can be varied. I think there will be a prioritization in terms of making hydrogen available for fertilizer, petrochemical, steel. But I suppose the power industry, the electricity industry, is another good use case for hydrogen. And I'll take a moment to just explain how this entire model could work. You have wind turbines and solar plants who generate electricity, but this electricity is not consumed all the time. Now, if you take the afternoon, solar belly, there is some curtailment of that solar energy. That energy could be pumped into an electrolyzer. You convert water into hydrogen, and then at that same place where you produce the hydrogen, you store it and you convert it to electricity through a gas turbine. Now, gas turbines are inherently capable of burning hydrogen. In fact, India has examples already of plants where we use hydrogen, albeit in a blend, to produce electricity. Now, when the electricity from the wind turbine and hydro plant is not available, that's when the stored hydrogen converts into electricity, and then you provide a round-the-clock green electron with a high PLF. So I think as the ecosystem develops, as economies of scale kick in, the cost of electricity will come down. Today's cost of electricity in this model could well be at, say, 6 rupees per kilowatt hour. But if the cost of hydrogen could come down to, say, for example, $2 per kg of hydrogen, which is roughly $14 per MMBTU in energy terms, then this 6 rupees per kilowatt hour could be in the range of 4 rupees, 25 paise. And that is, affordable, just given the fact that the average cost of production today is above that.
Understood. And the key question is, how soon do you think that we'll be able to achieve these levels?
It's a great question. It'll depend on how fast the government can come up with well-defined incentive programs and also mandates on consumption of the green hydrogen. Because the mandates will provide the volume case, the financial incentives will allow the cost of hydrogen to be lower. This will attract investment. In the absence of that, in any case, I'm seeing that there are announcements being made, but then to have these announcements get converted into practical investments on the ground, I think, sharper policies which are time-bound in nature and incentives linked to how much can you complete within what time period will probably accelerate. But to answer your question specifically, today the cost of hydrogen is $4.40 per kg. Maybe by 2025, this could come down to $3. And then by 2030, we have this ambition of achieving $1 per kg in one decade ending 2030. We may not hit $1, but we'll come close to it.
Right, and a key part to this, like you mentioned, in actually attracting investments would be sort of clearer policies and tighter timelines for those.
Correct. There's another big advantage of us to double down on hydrogen. Today, India imports a lot of LNG, and with what's happening in Europe with the war, the cost of LNG has skyrocketed to above $35. It's a very short market. Now, you can replace LNG with hydrogen, where you completely convert the model into a totally domestic fuel supply model, because it's your land, your water, your solar field, your electrolyzer. There is no import element involved in the production of hydrogen. And if you bring down the cost of hydrogen to $1, in energy terms, $1 per kg is $7.4 per MMBTU. That $7.4 per MMBTU, today in the international market, the cost of the same amount in LNG is $35. So you bring down the cost of gas, hydrogen gas, by 1/5. It has the same calorific value, close to, and that can be used for end-use energy purposes, replacing LNG totally. The other interesting point is on displacement of LNG with hydrogen. If you look at what's happened in the world today with the war in Europe, the cost of LNG has skyrocketed. It's gone to $35. At one point, it was $50. Now, that's unaffordable. Now, India has dependence on LNG, and that dependence can be replaced with hydrogen. And let me explain how. When it comes to hydrogen, you need land, which we have, you need water, which we have, you need electrolyzers, which our industry can manufacture. You have wind turbines, solar plants, hydro plants that feed these electrolyzers, making hydrogen completely green. Now, if this cost comes down to $1 per kg of hydrogen, in energy terms, that's $7.40 per MMBTU, as compared to $35, that is the price of LNG today. So not just that you get the benefit of the green hydrogen, which can convert into a green electron or green fertilizer or green steel, but you also have the affordability aspect, kind of met, because the cost is 1/5 as compared to today's price of LNG. Some may argue that the LNG prices will correct, but I suspect that we are in a short market, in the sense that this price of LNG is not correcting anytime before 2028, 29, 30. That's why we'll be better off investing in hydrogen and coming up with hydrogen for domestic purposes. Phase 2, if you look at the neighborhood in Asia, there are economies above $35,000 to $40,000 per GDP per capita, like for example Japan or Singapore, and they have acute needs to decarbonize with very few options.
Yeah.
Now, that's the market that India can cater to as a fuel supplier. We could convert hydrogen to ammonia, which then becomes a carrier of hydrogen, ship it to markets like Singapore, South Korea, Japan, and they will then use that as a feedstock to produce electricity, or as they call it, the scope 2 norms of ESG, the input cost that they get, or the input energy that they get at a low carbon or zero carbon. That's how they will decarbonize. So it's a domestic story for us in terms of cost, affordability, green electron, and over a period of time, it all will also convert itself into India becoming a fuel supplier of sorts to these markets that need, to decarbonize or deeply decarbonize aggressively.
So clearly, this perhaps will be the decade of hydrogen as it appears. You mentioned that you don't suspect energy prices, gas prices will correct in the near term, or even in the medium term. You're only expecting that they'll perhaps start to correct from 27, 28 onwards. In the interim, what are the options before us? And of course, hydrogen also, for it to become a reality, will involve, a long period of time. What can we tap into in the meantime?
That's a huge challenge for at least the Asian countries, countries like India, countries like, for example, Bangladesh. Liquid fuels are probably on an energy equivalent basis less expensive as compared to LNG. Existing contracts on LNG, as long as they get satisfied in terms of the contract terms, one should maximize. But beyond that, I think we'll have to come up with opportunity to kind of look at other options in terms of fuels that we have, rather than buying LNG at the current spot price. The general trend is 70% is on long-term contracts, so you have some safety net there. The 30% is on spot. I think that 30% market will probably either not be purchased at these prices, which is what we are seeing. People will wait, or there could be an emergency purchase, and if that happens, because there's no supply available in the market at the long-term price of say $12.50 to Brent for any new quantities, at least till 2028.
Right.
So you have uncertainty knocking at your door between 2022 and 2028, and there's no easy solution here.
So unfortunately, we brace ourselves for a little bit more pain for some time. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and speaking to us.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.